steel tides roar, engines echo through the
I'm
iron
Fred
shore.
McMurray, and I'm here with Eric Trout, Senior Vice President of Business Development for Harbor Freight Transport. This is Cargo Chronicles. Hi, Eric. How are we doing today?
Doing well. Trying to stay warm. Much of the United States is under a deep freeze and snow and ice, and yeah, so that's made day-to-day operations very challenging, especially with ports being shut down and backlogs of business. So now it's kind of trying to dig out of both the snow and the backlog. To be honest with
Wow, that should be its own topic. Um,
you.
Today we're going to talk about LCL. So, what is LCL?
Yeah, less than container load. Um, so, less than container load shipping is a great way. It's a very cost effective way and has some advantages versus just building enough critical mass of product, to fill either a 20-foot ocean container or a 40-foot ocean container. Uh, these are smaller size shipments, that go and they will be co-loaded into an ocean container with other customers' cargo. So much like the less than truckload world, where you have a truck picking up from multiple vendors and then distributing, the same can happen on ocean cargo, where you can have multiple vendors loaded into an ocean container. And so you're only paying for the amount of space that your products are taking up in that ocean container. So that's where the cost savings really comes in. So you have other clients that are loaded in there based upon their product. They might bear more of the cost for that shipping of that ocean container, and then you get your products into the U.S. or out of the U.S. if you're exporting, and gives you a lot of different options to be able to ship your cargo versus having to wait until you have a complete full container load for a 20 or a 40. The ocean charges for a 20-foot ocean container, depending upon the trade lane, are typically they're typically less expensive than a 40-foot ocean container ocean charges. For the most part, they are, but depending upon the freight lane, that cost could be maybe $1,000 less, or it could be a couple $100 less. Whereas if you're only shipping, let's say, 4 pallets worth of material versus loading those 4 pallets into a 20-foot ocean container and bearing that entire cost, you could ship them as less than container load, and you would only pay your portion of that 4 pallet spots or pallet positions. And it's all predicated on CBM, cubic meters of space, that you're taking up in that ocean container. And then you get charged for that and then the handling.
Okay, so what types of customers, or you said used the phrase lanes? What types of customers or lanes are driving the most LCL growth right now?
The various products. I mean, it's a wide range of products, but let's take the example of a my favorite, razor blades, right? Old school razor blades, the old safety razors. Um, a lot of people still use them here in the United States because they don't want to pay $25 for a razor, from one of these big ones. So, if you think about that, 4 pallets of razor blades, that could be almost in, one company's entire inventory for a year, right? So smaller type products like that, that you can bring over. Um, they could be high velocity, they could be low velocity, meaning they ship in fast, or they need to be warehoused. Either way, so that would be a great example of type of freight that would be a prime candidate for LCL, less than container load shipping. You'll also see some machinery, one or two pieces, depending upon the size. Can it go in a crate and be protected? Versus having to pay for the entire container load, you just would pay for that space. So, I mean, you can't really nail it down to here's a commodity that is, um, prevalent. It's more what makes sense and what's cost effective in the shipping.
Okay. So when do you decide an LCL should be consolidated into you said FCL, full container load? When should what's the break point of you say, well, no, we're going to put this into a dedicated FCL?
Well, that really depends upon the shipper, right? The vendor who produces it. So they have their freight rates, their ocean charges, etc. Most of those products, you've got a must arrive by date or a purchase order delivery date. So you've got to weigh in those factors of, you know, um, do I ship it, in a container by itself and have it go directly there, or do I add this extra step, send it to a co-loader, because that there is a timing effect to that, right? So the co-loader who will assemble those LCL containers, they they're not shipping. Well, they could ship, but most are not shipping on a daily basis. So you've got to have some time, consolidate, build up volume, then you load the full outbound container with multiple clients in there. So it's really whoever's paying the bills for the shipping, they've got to make that decision. Their logistics team has to look at it, but there are instances where it just makes a whole heck of a lot of sense, right? And that's a cost effective method of getting your products into the U.S. The other good thing about um, LCL shipping is most of those co-loaded containers go in the major trade lanes, right? So China to West Coast, Europe to East Coast, India to East Coast, etc. So what that does is it gives you multiple vessel sailings versus saying, okay, here's one container and it's going to Mobile, Alabama, right? And you have to wait for a vessel to be able to meet that. You know, you've got to find that sailing into the correct port, right? Not everybody goes into Mobile, Alabama, all ocean carriers. So something like that, you would probably co-load it and it would go into, say, Savannah, Georgia, where Harbor has our bonded warehouse, um, and then that cargo would get delivered to us, where we would then unload it, segregate it by shipment, by multiple vendor, and then monitor the customs clearance. Once it's customs cleared, then we can go ahead and facilitate the outbound trucking to
Okay.
the final destination.
All right. So you hit trucking, outbound trucking. What are this is a two-part question. What are the biggest cost drivers in LCL today? And how
Mhm.
does Harbor Freight Transport reduce those costs for their clients?
So there's a lot of hidden costs, right, in LCL shipping. Um, because you have the co-loading fee, then you have the unloading fee once it hits destination. those are pretty standard charges. You still have your customs clearance charges, but a lot of the unknown charges that people see are in particular like the waiting time. A lot of these LCL deconsolidators, less than container load deconsolidators, the bigger operations. I'm not going to use any names, but there's a couple that are out there that are known in the industry. And to be perfectly honest with you, some of the hidden costs would be like driver wait time at time of pickup or missed pickups.
Oh.
Um, because typically what will happen is a driver will get assigned to go into those facilities, and there's typically a lot of long lines, and drivers are waiting in line for hours upon hours, and then you get into driver detention. Some companies, will just go ahead and pull the truck out after an hour or possibly 2 hours of waiting. So you get a missed pickup, which you could incur a dry run fee or a missed pickup fee, etc. So that's where a lot of the hidden cost drivers, because the vendor, they get an overall picture of this is what it's going to cost me to get this shipment from origin to destination. They can calculate the ocean charges, they can calculate the handling charges, etc. It's those unknown charges once it lands that really can make the difference. Um, since it is smaller type shipments, you know, typical driver waiting time, what we'll call driver detention, um, it runs it basically, depending upon the area of the country, could run as high as $75 an hour all the way up to $125 an hour. So when you have a smaller size shipment, and let's just use $500 as your cost for argument's sake, to be able to absorb another $75 to $95 of unknown costs, that's a real watch out, right? And a real cost driver, which it's, there are ways to combat that, um, but it's one of those things where we want to educate our shipping community to say, hey, Harbor Freight Transport, we've been doing this for 78 years. We are not one of the big guys. We give you that really personal and tailored approach. Our driver lines are not that long. Typically, drivers are in and out within an hour. And we offer all the same services as all the big guys. So we are Class 3 customs bonded. We are a container freight station bonded as well, which means your cargo can sit there for 14 days versus doing a warehouse entry. And then we can also do our own outbound transportation with our network, right? Which is another great way to avoid some of those hidden fees, right? We'll give you a distribution charge, whether it's truckload, less than truckload, and say, here you go. This is your rate. And that rate will not include, if we have a driver that we hire and it's our own fault and we have driver wait time, we're not going to charge a customer for that.
So in a previous episode, we talked about ping pong balls versus nuts and bolts.
Yeah. Right.
So if you're telling me if somebody was shipping a less than container load of ping pong balls, and the driver ended up sitting there for 8 hours, they could have as much as what, $1,200 extra fees.
Typically what will happen is they'll pull the driver, and then you'll be assessed what's called a truck order not used, or a driver layover fee for that. Most trucking companies today they're going to give you the warnings about the driver detention before it comes into chargeable action. But then you've got to be able to have actionable, items to be able to get that truck loaded efficiently. So, typically those rates could get capped off at like a driver layover fee, like a $350 to $500 fee, or a driver would just be like, I'm not doing this anymore. I want a truck order not used, which is typically like $250. But hey, the fastest form of communication in my 28 years of experience in transportation logistics is an upset truck driver. I can tell you that. So it's certain shippers get branded as offending shippers, right? And if there's long driver wait lines, that communication gets out to the driving community, and that can affect your rates too, right? So truckers will see it and be like, oh, I'm not going into that container freight station because it typically takes 7 to 8 hours to get loaded. Therefore, I'm not going to do this. Or I'm going to charge X rate higher to account for that driver waiting time.
Okay. So then we've been kind of dancing around this, but what are the most common failure points in LCL shipments, and how does Harbor Freight Transport reduce the risk or mitigate them?
Well, I'd say one of the most common failure points is for the final delivery. You got to think of it this way. People don't realize the geography of the United States, right? It's a big country, and it's not like shipping in Europe or anywhere else like that where you can go cross borders and everything. So you've really got to look at the product and figure out the best method of transportation for it. And I'll give you a prime example. We have seen less than container load freight cargo that comes in, and it's loaded up in fairly large wooden crates, very well packaged, etc. Some of those crates could be long. When you look at it and you say, well, it's only 3 crates, and you look at the delivery order, which is a document that's used that shows the cubic feet and the volume and all that, it comes out as CBM, cubic meters. So you have 3 crates, and it's, for argument's sake, 90 cubic meters of space. Well, yeah, but unfortunately, one of those crates happens to be 12 foot long, right? You when you just get that delivery order and you look at it, 3 crates, 90 cubic feet going from Savannah, Georgia to, we'll use Birmingham, Alabama, you can say, oh, I'm just going to route this on a regular less than truckload carrier. Hidden cost, because that 1 crate is longer than 10 feet long, you're going to get an overlength charge, which, somebody sitting overseas would not have that carnal knowledge to be like, oh, maybe I should not use a regular LTL carrier. So a cost-effective way of doing that is to possibly use, like a hot shot carrier. And you've all seen those trucks on the road. They're regular, like pickup trucks with a trailer, a flatbed trailer behind it, typically a gooseneck. They call that a hot shot. That's probably a more cost-effective solution than shipping at LTL. So Harbor, within our network, because we are handling that cargo, we have the proper dimensions. We can do the quote unquote optimization, right, to figure out what is the best mode of transportation and what's in terms of handling as well as cost effectiveness.
So you described the flatbeds, and in California on the roads we call them annoying. Um, um, Other words I won't use on in public.
Yeah, California is very trucker friendly. I'll just leave it at
Yeah. All right. So
that.
um, how does LCL reliability compare to FCL across shipping lanes?
It's very reliable. Again, because it's just multiple clients loaded into one ocean container going, on a vessel. So it's very reliable in the fact that you're going to get multiple schedules going into multiple ports, etc. There is a timing aspect of it, though, that you could have 2 or 3 days at origin where it's not moving because that co-loader is waiting to consolidate and build critical mass to fill up that ocean container. And then on the flip side, once it arrives here in the U.S., it has to go to a container freight station (CFS) to be deconsolidated. So, depending upon the operation at the CFS, it could sit, 2 3 days before it actually gets unloaded. There's other aspects where you've got to worry about customs clearance. Now, the vendor, whoever the shipper is, or the vendor who's buying it based on your Incoterms, your terms of sale, that's you're going to have to clear those shipments individually, right? So each vendor is responsible for doing the customs clearing. So that could be a potential choke point as well, waiting on your customs broker to get that product cleared.
So that sounds like that would drive costs up if you've got to sit there waiting for it to clear.
So yes, you do have what's called uh, storage fees, right? Typically, the container freight station warehouse will give you X amount of free days for your cargo to sit. If you don't pick it up, before those free days, then yeah, there is a daily charge for storage of that product.
Okay. Um, let's talk about technology a bit. Um, when if I'm I'm somebody that's shipping something LCL, uh, what type of visibility do I have into that shipment, and how is Harbor Freight Transport better?
Well, we're not a freight forwarder, right? So we're a co-loader. We're just the receiving end, or for the deconsolidation or the consolidation. Um, so the co-loaders and freight forwarders typically have very good visibility options where you can see container it's loaded into, the container seal number, and then tracking while it's on the ocean, vessel discharge, etc. And then, depending upon the co-loader that you're using, um, they've got visibility tools as to where the cargo is in transit as well. So you do know where it's at. Harbor Freight, we have our own internal systems, inventory management systems, where once we get the containers to be deconsolidated or consolidated, you do have online visibility to where that product is. And on that website, you get to see the last free days, et cetera, right? In order to action, whatever your action needs to be, get it moving or store it, et cetera.
Okay. I want to talk about customers who use this. Um,
Mhm.
Customer, I've been shipping my uh less than crate load of ping pong balls. For some reason, I like ping pong balls. And we'll say I'm shipping them from overseas, and the American public's going berserk playing ping pong again. Probably won't happen, but for this for this example, what
Yeah,
would
pickleball maybe, but yeah.
maybe what would you advise me as a client uh, about transitioning from LCL to FCL as my volume scales? What should I be aware of? What's my gotchas? What's my good job is going to decrease cost or something like that?
Um, I mean, it's there's no real gotchas on it. It's just not everybody has the critical mass to be able to ship a full container load, right? So
Mhm.
the most cost-effective solution is truly to use a co-loader. Um, a freight forwarder and co-loaders, they're kind of the same, but they're different. A freight forwarder has more encompassing services versus a co-loader. But a freight forwarder who has multiple clients, they can build their own consolidation box and they don't have to use a co-loader, right? So typically, this cargo will deliver to a freight forwarder's origin operation warehouse, and the cargo is going to sit there, and then it'll get put out on the next available sailing. So you can see multiple when you have multiple clients. We saw this a lot, in particular towards the end of the week. You're shipping out Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then Friday you're sitting there with a lot of different pieces, right? um, a lot of different pieces that did not go out because you're building or you're waiting to try to build a box, a direct loaded box to final destination. So a freight forwarder could use this strategy to build their own consolidation box, and the optimization behind it's pretty simple. You can look at all the cargo that's sitting or that you have left over. If it's going to the southeast, group all that together and ship it to Savannah, Georgia, to Harbor Freight's warehouse. We can deconsolidate and move it. If it's going northeast, mid Atlantic, ship it into Newark, New Jersey, right? West Coast, LA, Long Beach. So, versus having cargo sit there at origin, you can keep that product steadily moving. So that would be a good strategy for a freight forwarder who has multiple clients. They can build their own consolidation container. Use somebody like a Harbor Freight versus one of these larger CFS guys, container freight station companies that typically get the long lines and all that other stuff.
Okay. What do you see as the biggest misconception customers have about LCL, and how does it affect their outcomes?
Um, the biggest misconception I would say is it's an information black hole. It's not. It's you do have the visibility. A lot of people used to shy away from it because they said, I don't have control over my supply chain. I've got no idea where the product is at any given time because there's a lot of different parties involved. But I'd say today's technology, all of those barriers have been knocked down. You've got very good visibility to it from the time it's loaded into the ocean container all the way till it arrives here at destination. And then, the other misconception is that there's going to be high distribution rates for that product going out, right? When you ship it out. That's not always the case. As I said, you've got to have somebody who knows how to speak the language. Um, I used to say, we're the LCL um, interpreters, right? Because you have to think about this. If you go to a typical U.S. less than truckload carrier and you pick up the phone, talk to your local terminal, and say, "I've got 3 pallets um, of product. It's 90 CBM, and it weighs 3,000 kgs. Well, I can tell you the guy or gal on the phone, at that local LTL terminal is going to be like, "Hey, that's fabulous. What's a CBM and what's a kg?" I need it in pounds, and I need to know exactly how many pallets this is going to be. And oh, by the way, what's the freight classification? So that's where a lot of the it can be annoying for international shippers to be able to put up with that, right? And so Harbor Freight, we are the quote unquote interpreter, the translator. We can look at that and say, hey, it's 90 CBM, it's X amount of cartons, it's going to be the equivalent of X amount of pallets. Freight class is going to be class 65. Picking up from this origin zip code, going to this destination zip code, here's your rate, bam, all in rate. So it's that's some of the pitfalls when people try to figure it out. They don't know the final delivery charges because they're just not that familiar with the American pricing programs for truckload or less than truckload.
They still haven't figured out we're not on the metric system.
No. One of my favorite skits is that Nate Bargatze, Saturday Night Live, where he's talking about George Washington and the metric system. And yeah, I don't know if you've ever seen that, but
Haven't seen that one, but yeah.
It's hilarious.
I remember getting told when I was in 6th or 7th grade, we're going to go to the metric system. And yeah, that was multiple decades ago. Still ain't there.
Not there. Yeah.
All right. Got a couple other questions. How
Okay.
do you see LCL evolving over the next 3 to 5 years? What changes are coming? What needs to happen in it?
I mean, in my opinion, what needs to happen is there needs to be a pricing mechanism that's easier for people overseas to be able to figure out the destination delivery charges, right? Because again, they're only seeing maybe 3/4 of the entire cost, right? So they can calculate their origin charges, they can calculate the ocean charges, the amount of money they're going to take, it's going to cost them, to ship X amount of space. It's that final delivery charge that really needs to needs to be improved, right? Matter of fact, it was about a year ago. I was working with a company of mine that I used to previously work for, and they wanted to go down to our Savannah, Georgia facility and just kind of see behind the scenes what we do, because they are not prolific in international ocean shipping whatsoever. And that was one of the things that we discussed is, you got to think of it this way. When you're at origin, all you see is you're shipping from China and your final destination is Birmingham, Alabama. They don't know the zip code of the warehouse. In order to get that final delivery rate, let me step back. In order to get that final delivery rate to Birmingham, Alabama, you need to be able to know the zip code of where that cargo is going to land, that warehouse, where it's going to be deconsolidated and then picked up from, and then the final delivery. So a lot of the carriers do not have a good pricing mechanism to be able to say, it's going to go into Newark, New Jersey, but what's the zip code? Well, I can't tell you which warehouse it's going to, because there's a lot of different deconsolidators and CFS locations in Newark, New Jersey, Elizabeth, New Jersey, Linden, New Jersey. They're all different zip codes. And to be able to get an LTL rate, you have to know, this is my origin warehouse zip code. This is my delivery destination zip code, right? So if you were to just say Newark, New Jersey, do a rate quote, and all of a sudden it shows up in Linden, New Jersey, there could be a rate differential in it, right? So that's a cost driver. So I think some of the pricing mechanisms need to, first and foremost, get away from the zip to zip, in particular to this international cargo. You're never going to get away from zip code to zip code for domestic shipping. But if it's an international shipment coming in, you should just be able to have a pricing mechanism that says, hey, if it's going to go into the port of Los Angeles or Long Beach and it's going to Las Vegas, Nevada, I should just be able to put in LA, Long Beach, and then here's my destination in Nevada, right? That doesn't exist. The other thing that the carriers need to improve on, because you've got to look at the timing on it. Fuel surcharge, right? Fuel is a major cost driver for every trucking operation. Fuel fluctuates on a week-to-week basis. And so fuel surcharge scales basically change every Tuesday when the Department of Energy publishes out the average rate of diesel, the national average. So if you reached out and got a rate quote for something 45 days ago, well, you've already had four different changes in your fuel surcharge. Now you throw in something, event driven, let's say, a war, something like that, where the price of energy skyrockets, then your rate quote that you had from 45 days could be severely affected, just because of fuel surcharge.
So what I just heard was the farther out I get my rate quote, the more likely it is wrong.
It could change, yeah. And so I think an area of improvement, and that was one of the things that I had a discussion with, with this one particular carrier, was if you're going to build this pricing mechanism out, you need to be able to honor the quoted fuel surcharge at least 60 days. You can't just say, oh, well, I quoted that 45 days ago and now fuel is X, right? That's, in my opinion, not fair to the shipper, right? You should be able to say, so give them a landed cost, for that transportation and hold by that rate quote. So I do think carriers need to get better on that. And I would love to see that improvement. So that the two improvements, just build a nice, simple, pricing platform that says, hey, it's going to Seattle, Tacoma. Seattle, Tacoma are, I think it's 65 miles difference, between the port of Seattle and the port of Tacoma. Man, that could really affect the pricing, on the quote. So did it show up in Seattle or did it show up in Tacoma? Well, should just be able to say Seattle, Tacoma to, Walla Walla, Washington, and get a rate, something like that. And that rate should have the fuel surcharge pegged, for when that rate quote is, and be valid for 45, 60 days. I know a lot of truckers are probably going to be like, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about, but you will attract a lot more business that way, for sure.
All right. So last question. What is it you want our listeners, your potential clients, potential vendors, people that work with you, what is it you want them to know about Harbor Freight Transport?
Well, we're not the big guys. Like I said, the CFS locations, we're not the big guys. We do overflow work for them. When they get busy, they bring their containers over to us and we devan them, and, we act as their CFS. I'd have to say, probably the target audience would be the freight forwarders, You know, I would say look at your own network, in particular to, you know, towards the end of the week. What, are you loading out light loaded 20s? Are you loading a 20-foot ocean container with only 2 to 3 pallets in it? You know, can you build your own consolidation containers for your clients? If so, then consider a shop like Harbor Freight, you know, at our warehouses, because we can offer all the same services that all the big CFSs can, right? And you get a much more personal uh, feel to it, and you know, it's we've got the ability to pull it out of the port and all the way to the final destination, and we're always going to be looking out for the client's best interests and doing that optimization through our knowledge and experience, right? What's the best, most effective, cost effective way to deliver your products?
So did I just hear optimizing freight logistics for your clients is what Harbor Freight does?
We try to, yes, on a daily basis.
Any final words?
Uh, just, just everybody be safe on the roads out there. You know, truckers and this freight industry, it's here to stay. And you know, it's a tough life. You just got to appreciate the fact that they're all out there trying to make a living, and you know, be safe first and foremost.
Amen. I'm tired of avoiding near accidents with folks, but that's
Yeah,
beside. And that's not even just truckers. That's just California drivers. Um,
right.
all right. I'm Fred McMurray, and I've been talking with Eric Trout, Senior VP of Business Development for Harbor Freight Transport, who is actually going to expand Harbor Freight Transport so that they're one of the big ones. And we'll document it along the way, folks.
There
See you.
you go.
Happy shipping.
Thank you.